Welcome back! Or, if you're new here, welcome to the Media Literacy Guidebook. This is going to be another special of sorts. I'm discussing Alexis Romero Walker's article called Using Critical Media Literacy to Create a Decolonial, Anti-Racist Teaching Philosophy. We've discussed aspects of media literacy in the past, but one thing we haven't really touched on is how to best educate people on the topic. Part of the intervention is through videos like these, but there's certainly more that can be done. Additionally, it's important to recognize that education in the United States is done, however unintentionally, under the umbrella of whiteness and white privilege. This article discusses ways to incorporate critical media literacy principles to help break down systems of whiteness and, as Walker says, adopt an anti-racist decolonial pedagogy. To understand this article, we first need to understand what white privilege is. The concept of white privilege is very nuanced and deserves its own video series, but for the purposes of our discussion, we'll keep it relatively simple. White privilege is a privilege of society that benefits and uplifts white people over non-white people in some cultures, particularly and especially in the United States. This can occur despite both peoples having the same socioeconomic or political circumstances. In short, white people have benefits in society that non-white people do not. There's so much more to this concept that's beyond the scope of this video to cover, so let me recommend the seminal text on the subject by Peggy McIntosh, White Privilege, Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack. I'll link it in the down there part. With this in mind, let's jump into the article itself. Walker starts by identifying herself as a white-passing Latina student and educator, and notices that when classrooms have all-white students, or all-white-passing students, diverse identities are discarded and glossed over. She argues that higher education is built on norms of whiteness, such as expected dialects, desired reverence, and so on. These norms are uninviting to people of color, or POC. She discusses a particularly troubling example in a journalism class that is meant to illustrate the principles of objectivity. During the reporting of stories on racial justice, students, including POC students, are told that they must include perspectives of opposing parties, in this case that opposing party being white supremacist. The students are then told that by not incorporating these opposing viewpoints, that they're not creating a, quote, equal playing ground and thus aren't being objective. Walker continues by saying that this tells POC students that they must put themselves and their bodies in danger by talking with these people. Should they desire not to do that, like most sane people would, they're not behaving in a so-called professional manner. Psst, for a really good reason why we shouldn't give open platforms to Nazis and white supremacists, check out philosopher Karl Popper's The Paradox of Tolerance. POC are encouraged to navigate these spaces of whiteness that are inhospitable to them. Classrooms are prime locations where social norms are reinforced, particularly through student performance. Some of these norms include ideas and concepts that we as educators take for granted. One example that Walker uses is attendance and its relative tardiness. Both are often used in grading without much thought given to how they actually contribute to cross-learning objectives. Walker said that these are common sense policies that most assume are just important by their nature. She continues to say that minority students tend to be more affected by these policies due to outside influences, thus meaning that POC students receive lower grades. This isn't due to a lack of work ethic or not achieving learning outcomes, but because they can't meet the classroom norms of attendance and timeliness. Walker goes on to critique expected student behavior, such as sitting attentive for hours, raising one's hand to ask a question, taking notes, and so on, as practices learned and performed with the promise of success. She goes on to say that this acts as a cultural enclosure, where POC and Black students in particular must constantly perform education, with standard multiple choice tests and quizzes, and writing with dialect, i.e. code switching, in a manner that is acceptable to white audiences. These habits discourage a learning process that invites POC and Black cultural expression. Other examples that Walker includes are normalizing white culture, advocating a sort of colorblind ideology, and being taught to perform, quote, according to the standards of whiteness and to use Western media-making practices, even if these practices conflict with their interest in positively representing their communities. Walker also brings up an excellent point about three-point lighting, which is a basic lighting practice that all film and video students are taught. In a nutshell, three-point lighting uses a key light, a fill light, which fills in shadows, and a backlight, which separates the subject from the background. While this is a great setup for most, people with darker skin don't benefit from this particular setup, and very rarely do educators teach methods to use on subjects with darker skin. Walker goes on to say that this lighting practice, when used on POC and Black bodies, makes them look scary, which reinforces stereotypes about POC being violent and menacing. All of this is to say that, according to Walker, higher education comes with normalized assumptions that are decades, if not centuries, old. Our learning institutions and practices are not accommodating to diverse demographics and still make choices in educational practices based on the assumptions of white, upper middle class, heterosexual male bodies. This, Walker says, forces assimilation on POC students. So what can we do to break down these barriers and create a more equitable learning environment in practice? Walker argues that we must decolonize higher education and develop an anti-racist classroom and curricula. That's a great start, but how do we do it? First, let's look at decolonization. Walker says that we must interrogate how Western power structures dominate classroom materials. This includes how thought is controlled, which undermines both the loss and inequities of those being marginalized. Generally speaking, traditional school curricula teaches and reinforces beliefs that support colonization. So to decolonize is to include all knowledge systems and culture in curricula. Walker argues that, particularly in media education, Indigenous and non-Western perspectives are often marginalized or excluded entirely, and there's a definite point there. One example from the top of my head is art history. I vividly recall learning about ancient Greek art, the fan art of the Bible, the Renaissance, which is to say all European and Western based. But I can't think of any concrete examples of art from African, South American, or Southern Asian countries from the classroom. Why? Why weren't these represented in the curriculum? Walker goes on to say that efforts have been made to diversify curricula, but they're often what she calls additive, perpetuating the concept of otherness. A classic example that she uses is having, say, a week dedicated to diverse voices, as opposed to spreading this information throughout the course. By clumping information together like this, it continues the concept of the other while reinforcing whiteness as the norm. Another way to disrupt and decolonize is to include students in the creation of the classroom environment, working together to include, for example, more discussion-based lessons, using and normalizing popular culture, creating a casual setting, and allowing students to help create what the rooms and assignments will look like. These all will help students feel comfortable and create new, more inviting norms. So this is a couple of brief examples on how we can decolonize the classroom. Now, where does media literacy specifically fit into this discussion? Well, we know that media literacy involves, in part, as Walker says, looking at constructed media messages and languages. We also know that media literacy involves deconstructing common norms of race, gender, socioeconomic status, body size, sexuality, and the like. Walker adds 5 additional questions that educators could ask themselves while developing their curriculum that both dismantles troublesome social norms and includes principles that further decolonize the classroom. These questions are: 1. Is the language I use from a perspective of whiteness? If so, what are the consequences of using that language? 2. Am I teaching skills as if they are rules? 3. Do I overemphasize content considered canonical and treat other content as additional or, quote, alternative? 4. Am I observing how individual students react to content? 5. Am I constraining students to perform in a way per my perception of normal classroom rules? Now, these questions aren't meant to be the end of the discussion by any means. These are just one of many ways to question and potentially dismantle white privilege in the curriculum. By approaching this from the perspective of media literacy, educators of all disciplines can avoid classrooms becoming what Walker describes as sites of oppression, and instead focus on escaping principles of whiteness. Other methods Walker mentions include showing and allowing students to create counter-narratives to hard and fast rules, which perhaps applies more to the arts, but could be incorporated in other disciplines as well. Including perspectives from marginalized communities throughout the semester, as mentioned earlier, acknowledging and responding when students feel uncomfortable, and examining rules and expectations to see if they truly align with your learning objectives, rather than simply policing the bodies of students in the classroom. To some, Walker says that educators must be willing to audit their classrooms, content, and themselves in order to cultivate a better classroom for everybody. The pedagogy that Walker describes is an excellent way to deconstruct white privilege in higher education and let marginalized people learn and grow in a safe, productive manner. It is, as Walker says, a step forward in dismantling current knowledge systems of whiteness. It's certainly something that I've taken to heart and will try my best to incorporate going forward in these videos, and certainly if I'm fortunate enough to teach again professionally. This was a heavy topic, but an important one, and something we always need to keep in the back of our mind while discussing education in general and media literacy in particular. Even if you're not an educator, I hope you managed to take something away from this video on white privilege, decolonization, and learning about anti-racist pedagogy. Today's recommended media is Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Freire argues that education traditionally serves as a means to serve the status quo. In order to combat that, education needs to be vastly reformed through a process of consciousness raising, dialogue, and collaboration between both teacher and student. This is considered to be one of the essential texts on how education can be changed to better fit the needs of marginalized people. I'll put a link to a free PDF of the book below. I'm also including Dr. Jason Campbell's first chapter in his large video series covering the book as well. Links again will be in the down there part. Thank you for joining me on this short but hopefully helpful overview of Alexis Romero Walker's Using Critical Media Literacy to Create a Decolonial Anti-Racist Teaching Philosophy. Thank you for watching and have a wonderful day. See you next time.